In 865, England tried to purchase peace with a currency no priest would ever bless: horses, not gold, not a vow, not a wedding alliance. Horses, warm bodies that eat grain, carry men, and turn a coastal raid into an inland occupation. That single detail is the kind history hides behind hero speeches, because it makes conquest look less like destiny and more like accounting. So here is the governing question that will not let this story go. When a kingdom collapses, is it defeated by violence, or by the moment fear becomes a system, contracts, winter camps, supply lines, and starts collecting interest? Chronicles whisper. But the ground doesn't. Bones, walls, and price tags do. If you care about the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Now, about the story you've probably heard, the cursed bones in 1066. A later saga tradition claims William the Conqueror feared a dead Viking more than living Englishmen. That before Hastings, before crowns and slaughter, he ordered a certain mound opened and the remains burned, because legend said those bones made England unconquerable. It's a perfect myth, clean, cinematic, morally comforting. Kill the corpse, win the country, history as exorcism. But that legend is already confessing something true, even while it lies about the details. It admits that power is not only fought in fields, it's fought in minds. And minds don't obey swords alone, they obey stories. If you can make a population believe their safety lives inside a grave, you can also make them believe their safety lives inside a treaty, a tribute payment, a hostage exchange. You can make fear obey paperwork. And that is where the real record begins to turn cold. For decades, Viking raids were seasonal. Fast strikes, summer smoke, autumn disappearance. Terrifying, yet predictable. Then, in 865, the weather changes. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle stops describing isolated raids and starts describing an arrival that feels like a new category of disaster. A great army that intends to stay. Great here doesn't just mean big. It means coalition, multiple leaders, multiple crews, one shared appetite. An army like that has a weakness more lethal than any Saxon sword: logistics. Thousands of mouths, thousands of feet. Winter. So what does a serious invasion do first? Not a glorious battle. It buys mobility. It buys food. It buys time. And England, divided into rival kingdoms, helps pay for it. East Anglia, staring at a horizon blackened with sails, bargains for survival and gives the invaders the one resource that turns terror into territory: horses. That transaction is not a footnote. It is a door opening. With mounts, the invaders can move faster than warnings, outrun musters, and strike where the map says they shouldn't be able to reach. And in later memory, one name becomes the symbol of that shift: Ivar, called the Boneless. Maybe he was disabled. Maybe the nickname meant something else: snake-like, hated, uncanny. You can argue medicine all day and still miss the political psychology. The point is that the story doesn't worship his legs. It worships his effect. A war that learns to price an island. Horses, grain, hostages, cities. The human cost is not collateral. It is the business model. So before we chase gore, before we chase legends of ritual torture, we have to stare at the first receipt. Because once fear is written into a deal, once survival is purchased, conquest no longer needs to win every battle. It only needs you to keep paying. The Viking terror, England thought it understood, was seasonal. It had a rhythm that almost looked merciful, if you're desperate enough to call predictability mercy. Summer ships, fast raids, a monastery burned like kindling, a handful of bodies, a handful of relics. Then the sea swallowed the attackers again, and the survivors rebuilt their roofs and told themselves the storm had passed. That illusion dies in 865. The record doesn't give you a villain's speech. It gives you a change in tone. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles stops treating the Vikings like bad weather and starts treating them like a political condition, something that stays. It names what arrives not as a raid, but as an army. Not a crew, but a coalition. A force large enough to demand winter shelter, to demand food in bulk, to demand the kind of planning that turns a coastline problem into a national disease. Great isn't just a number. Great means the usual responses no longer work. Local levies can't chase it. A single king can't buy it off forever. And the church, England's memory machine, can't write fast enough to keep up with what is happening to its world. Here's the part modern audiences miss, because it isn't cinematic. A big army has a weakness that can kill it more surely than any shield wall. Hunger, winter, logistics. A raiding party can live off panic. A long occupation needs grain, forage, horses, repair, shelter, routes, information. It needs a place to sit down and not starve. And England hands them that place. East Anglia looks like a soft target on the map, flat, accessible, and politically exposed. But the real reason it matters is uglier. It is a storehouse. It can feed an army. When that fleet arrives and the horizon goes dark with sails, the East Anglian response is not heroic. It is rational. It is the logic of a small kingdom facing a force too large to beat quickly. They bargain. They pay. And what they pay with is not primarily silver. It is mobility. Horses. Think about the psychology of that transaction. You are not just giving the invaders animals. You are handing them your country's speed. You are letting them turn English land into a road system for foreign violence. You're trying to purchase a quiet winter, and you're financing the machine that will destroy the neighbors you've spent generations competing against. That's what fear does to politics. It turns rivals into accomplices. It turns survival into collaboration without ever needing a signature in blood. And the Vikings, whatever you want to call them, raiders, pagans, barbarians, behave here like something more modern than medieval fantasy. They behave like strategists who understand that terror alone is expensive. A burned monastery makes smoke. A winter base makes control. If you can winter safely, you don't have to gamble everything on one battle. You can threaten, negotiate, return, tighten. You can convert panic into policy. This is where the story's central question becomes real in the mud, not in myth. If conquest is just violence, it ends when the violence stops. But if conquest is a system, if it can be fed, housed, moved, and replicated, then it doesn't need to kill everyone. It only needs to make enough people do the reasonable thing. Pay, yield, provide, look away, keep the barns full, Keep the roads open. Keep telling yourself you're buying time. The great heathen army winters. That one decision is a declaration. England is no longer a place to visit. It is a place to reorganize. And in that pause, this supposed rest, you can feel the true weapon being forged. Not an axe, a network, roots, scouts, knowledge of which kingdoms hate each other, which kings are weak, which towns are walled, which rivers are navigable, where the grain sits, where the horses are. Conquest begins to look less like a raid and more like an audit. Later tradition likes to hang a single name on that shift, Ivar. The stories paint him as the mind, cold, patient, humiliatingly strategic. Whether you accept every saga detail or not, the structural truth remains. Someone in that coalition understood that England's greatest vulnerability was not cowardice. It was fragmentation. Too many crowns, too many grudges, too many kingdoms living like neighbours who refuse to share a wall when the fire comes. And the horse deal is proof of concept. If one frightened king can be pressured into funding your mobility, then every kingdom becomes a potential warehouse. Every treaty becomes a weapon. Every compromise becomes a future invoice. The army breaks camp. The men who once depended on sails now ride. That is the moment raids become occupation. Because now the Vikings don't just arrive. They appear where they shouldn't be able to appear. And somewhere to the north, a kingdom called Northumbria is busy bleeding itself in a civil war. Two rival kings tearing their own house apart. That's not a coincidence. It's an invitation. Because the next move isn't to chase gold, it's to take a city that will rewrite the map, and to set a trap so perfectly that two kings will walk into it thinking they are saving their capital. York is waiting. York wasn't just a dot on a map. It was a memory of empire made into stone, Roman walls, an old administrative spine, a place that told the north of England, someone used to govern from here. That's why taking York mattered more than burning 10 monasteries. Fire is noise. York is infrastructure. York is permission. The kind that lets an invader stop being a visitor and start acting like a landlord. And this is the first moment the invasion stops looking like a barbarian stampede and starts looking like a mind at work. Because if you're only chasing revenge, you sail straight at the king you hate and gamble everything on a single blow. But an army that winters, an army that has accepted the slow work of feeding itself, doesn't need to rush. It can choose targets the way a creditor chooses debtors, not by emotion, but by vulnerability. Northumbria is vulnerable in the oldest way. It is split. 2 kings, 2 claims, 2 factions, bleeding their own manpower into the soil, while a foreign army learns the roads. Civil war is the most generous thing a kingdom can do for an invader. It empties the granaries and fills the graveyards before the enemy even arrives. So, the great heathen army moves. Not by ship now, not as a coastal nightmare, but as a mounted threat, sliding inland faster than messages can travel. That horse deal from East Anglia stops being an appeasement and becomes what it really was, the purchase of English speed. When your enemy can move faster than your musters, your walls become decor, your kings become delayed. York falls. The sources don't need to romanticize it for the point to stand. The city is taken, occupied, turned into a base. Later storytellers like to add cinematic timing, holy days, distracted guards, worshippers caught between hymns and screams. Maybe that is exactly how it felt. Maybe it's how a society explains why it lost something it believed it deserved to keep. Either way, the psychological function is obvious. A sacred calendar is supposed to tame fear. So when violence arrives on a holy day, it doesn't just kill bodies, it humiliates meaning. Now the trap closes. Because the moment York is lost, Northumbria's civil war becomes irrelevant. The rival kings, Ella and Osbert, do what frightened elites always do when the floor drops out from under them. They reconcile, they unite, they march. They tell themselves unity will fix what arrogance broke. And this is where you need to understand the brutality of strategic patience. The invaders do not panic. They do not flee. They do not waste their advantage by scattering back into the countryside. They stay inside York. They occupy the walls. They let the kings come to them. This is not courage. It is geometry. A relieving army attacking a fortified city is forced to compress itself, to bunch up, to funnel through streets, gates, breaches, into a space where numbers become a disadvantage. Outside in the open, a desperate kingdom can stretch its line and pretend it has options. Inside a city you don't control, options evaporate. You're fighting in a narrow mouth with a blade at the back of your throat. The battle is a catastrophe. Whether it was a street fight, a breach, a collapse into chaos, the outcome is the same. The Northumbrian force is shattered, and both kings die. 2 crowns extinguished in one campaign. For England, this isn't just defeat. It is decapitation. A kingdom doesn't only lose soldiers when it loses kings. It loses the story that binds the soldiers together. Now, here comes the part people want most, because it's the part that absolves the audience of complicity. If you can reduce the Vikings to a single act of theatrical cruelty, you can file the whole invasion under monsters. Close the drawer and feel clean. This is where the saga tradition drags a body into the light and dares you to look away. The alleged blood eagle. The story says that King Ella, Ragnar's executioner in legend, was not merely killed, but turned into a ritual. Ribs opened like wings, lungs displayed as a grotesque emblem. It is the kind of image that doesn't ask to be believed. It demands to be repeated. But here's the confrontation. Whether that execution happened exactly as later texts describe it is debated for good reason. Poetry can be misunderstood. Metaphor can be mistaken for anatomy. Christian writers had motives. Fear sells, horror unites, barbarism justifies. And yet, the deeper truth doesn't require surgical certainty. The deeper truth is that terror doesn't need to be fully accurate to be fully effective. It needs to be plausible enough to travel. A rumor can govern. A rumor can do administrative work. It can lower the price of conquest by raising the cost of resistance. It can convince a town to open its gates because the alternative is being remembered as the next lesson. This is how fear becomes a system. York becomes a demonstration site. Not just, we can take your city, but we can erase your leadership. Not just we can kill, but we can decide how you will be afraid. And once fear is standardized, once it becomes predictable, shareable, contagious. You no longer need to win everyone by force. You win by making collaboration feel like the only rational option left. Which brings us back to the governing question with sharper teeth. If conquest is only violence, it ends when you're tired. But if conquest is logistics plus psychology, if it can be fed, moved, and mythologized, then it can expand like a market. And now that Northumbria is decapitated, a new possibility opens. England doesn't just have enemies. It has vacancies, power gaps, thrones that can be sold, rented, puppeted. The invaders can start doing something far more dangerous than raiding. They can start appointing. So the question is no longer, who will stop them? It's uglier. Which kings will try to buy survival next? And what will they pay with when silver isn't enough? Because the army that learned to turn horses into conquest is already turning its eyes south. After York, people want a simple explanation. They want a moral shape they can hold in one hand, a family tragedy, a son's grief, a revenge oath that turns into an invasion. It's comforting because it makes the war feel emotional, human, almost predictable. You hurt me, I hurt you back. That's why the Ragnar story survives. In the sagas, Ragnar is captured by a Christian king and killed in a pit of snakes. The dying hero spits out a prophecy about piglets squealing when they learn how the old boar suffered. It is perfect narrative fuel, vengeance framed as destiny. But if you go looking for that scene in the hard record of 9th century England, you don't find a tidy cinematic death. What you find are movements of armies, winter camps, tribute, and kings who keep disappearing from the political board like pieces taken in a game nobody agreed to play. So let's be brutally honest about what revenge is in this story. Revenge is not the engine. Revenge is the banner. It is the emotionally satisfying cover story that recruits men, binds rival warlords into a coalition, and turns a risky expedition into something that feels righteous. In any violent society, the fastest way to organize strangers is to give them a shared grievance and a shared target. Avenge Ragnar is a sentence that can travel from harbor to harbor without needing a treaty. It can unite egos that would otherwise fight each other. It can justify brutality without admitting the real motive. Conquest is profitable. Because that's what the winter strategy proves. A seasonal raid is a gamble. You show up, you burn, you leave. You might get silver if you survive the chase back to the ships. But an occupation is an investment. It requires food, horses, intelligence, repair, and patience. And what do you get for that patience? You get the ability to harvest the land again and again. You get leverage. You get kings paying you to go away. You get the power to decide who rules next. York is not just a victory. It's a demonstration of a new method. The Great Army doesn't only kill, it waits inside walls. It forces enemies to compress themselves. It turns a city into a trap and a civil war into a gift. 2 kings die, and suddenly Northumbria is not merely defeated. It is administratively empty. That is the moment conquest becomes governance. A throne without a king is a vacancy. Vacancies can be filled. And the Vikings? Again, call them monsters if you want, but don't let the label make you blind. Understand something the later legends hide. You don't need to annihilate a kingdom to control it. You just need to break its leadership, then install compliance. A ruler who owes his crown to your mercy is cheaper than an army you must feed forever. This is the ugly genius of indirect rule. Violence is the audition. Collaboration is the job offer. Notice how the story keeps circling back to transactions. First, East Anglia pays in horses. That is not a random detail. It is the invasion's secret skeleton. Horses are how a sea people becomes an inland empire. Horses are how an army stops being chased and starts hunting. With speed, you don't have to storm every fortress. You can bypass. You can appear where no one expects you. You can make the act of gathering resistance feel futile. That is psychological warfare disguised as mobility. Then York falls, and the psychological message multiplies. Not just your walls can fail, but your kings can be removed. Once that idea takes hold, the economics of resistance changes. Every town now has to ask itself, do we spend blood for an uncertain stand, or do we pay silver for a delay? That is how conquest turns into a market. Fear sets the prices. Leaders become negotiators, not defenders. And negotiation, in a crisis, is just another form of surrender that pretends it has dignity. Here is the part people don't want to admit. England's fragmentation is doing half the invaders' work for them. Each kingdom hopes the fire will burn the neighbor first. Each ruler tells himself, if I pay, they'll move on. But paying doesn't remove the danger. It refuels it. Every piece purchased becomes proof that peace can be sold again. And that is why the revenge story is so useful, because it distracts you from the structure. If you believe the invasion is driven by grief, you imagine it ends when grief is satisfied. Kill the offending king. Go home. Case closed. But the great army doesn't behave like grief. It behaves like a system that discovered how to reproduce itself. Winter here, recruit there, extort there, move inland, take a city, install a compliant ruler, and repeat. Vengeance may have lit the first torch, but logistics is what keeps the furnace roaring. So when the stories talk about sadism, about ritual killings, about terror as theatre, don't let yourself get hypnotized by gore. Gore is not the point. Gore is the advertisement. The point is what the advertisement buys. Obedience, tribute, strategic paralysis, and the quiet complicity of people who decide survival is worth any price as long as the violence happens somewhere else. Now, look south. Northumbria has been shattered. York is a base. A compliant regime can be leaned on. The Great Army has horses, winter habits, and proof that English kings can be removed like obstacles. The next target is not chosen because it deserves revenge. It is chosen because it sits in the center of the island like a hinge, Mercia. And Mercia will do what frightened states always do when they face a force they cannot defeat quickly. It will negotiate. It will pay. It will try to rent a future. The only question is this: how much will peace cost when the invaders have learned that England will finance its own captivity? And who will sign the next invoice? Mercia sat in the middle of the island like a locked hinge. You could raid the coasts without truly owning England. But if you could bend Mercia, if you could force the central kingdom to flinch on command, you didn't just terrorize. You controlled movement, roads, rivers, the ability of other kingdoms to help each other. In a fractured land, the center is more valuable than the edge, because the center turns everyone else's survival into a negotiation. That's why the war changes here. After York, the Great Army doesn't act like a mob hunting blood. It acts like a creditor expanding a portfolio. It doesn't need to annihilate Mercia to profit from it. It only needs Mercia to do one thing repeatedly: pay. And this is where the moral cost becomes harder to outsource. Because paying for peace sounds civilized. It sounds like diplomacy. It sounds like restraint. But in practice, it is the conversion of fear into a schedule. It is violence turned into an invoice. You are expected to honor on time. The first time a kingdom pays, it tells itself a comforting lie. This is a one-time humiliation to spare our people. The second time, it becomes precedent. The third time, it becomes policy. And by then, the only real question is not whether you'll pay again, but what you will be forced to pay with when silver runs out. Mercia's rulers had every reason to believe the old pattern could still work. Seasonal raiders could be bought off. You hand them treasure, they vanish into the sea, and you call the transaction peace. But the Great Army isn't seasonal anymore. It winters. It moves inland. It holds cities. It has horses. It has the ability to return to the same throat whenever it wants. And that is what makes the bargaining so poisonous. You are not buying an ending. You are renting a delay. The Chronicles show this pivot in behavior even when they don't spell out the philosophy. The army appears in Mercian territory, and suddenly the political map starts behaving like a hostage situation. Mercia seeks help from Wessex. Alliances form not out of friendship, but out of panic. Armies gather, postures stiffen, and then, again and again, the crisis resolves not with a decisive battlefield triumph, but with a settlement, a payment, a promise, a truce that looks like mercy, until you notice who keeps gaining leverage. This is the kind of conquest that doesn't need a grand massacre to succeed. It needs repeated moments where leaders choose the reasonable option. Pay them to leave. Let them winter elsewhere. Hope the next target is your neighbor. Hope you can rebuild before they return. That hope is not cowardice. It's a human response to an enemy whose main weapon is uncertainty. But uncertainty is expensive. You can't run an economy on permanent emergency. You can't harvest fields while constantly mobilizing levies. You can't keep men under arms without starving the farms that feed them. And the Great Army understands that. Every time you raise a force, you bleed your own future. Every time you fail to crush them, you prove that bleeding is pointless. So tribute becomes a kind of ritual, an anti-battle that still rearranges power. It's not only the coins, it's the humiliation of acknowledging, publicly, that your kingdom's safety is now contingent on an outsider's mood. It's the psychological shift from sovereignty to dependency. Once that shift happens, collaboration stops looking like treason and starts looking like administration. Officials begin to manage the payments. Towns begin to measure their survival in months. Clergy begin to write prayers that double as political instructions. Endure, comply, outlast. This is where the philosophy of power in the Viking Age starts to resemble something far more modern than axe and fire stereotypes. You don't need to occupy every village if you can control the decision-making of those who govern them. A puppet is cheaper than a garrison. A terrified king is a more efficient tax collector than a foreign soldier. Fear is a currency that doesn't rust, and the Great Army spends it like silver. But there is another uglier layer beneath the tribute: complicity. Paying for peace isn't just something kings do. It is something societies learn to justify. Merchants accept it because trade can continue, barely. Landowners accept it because fields can be planted, barely. Towns accept it because walls won't be tested today, barely. Everyone learns to frame payment as pragmatism, and pragmatism, in a crisis, becomes the moral language of surrender. This is why the monster narrative is so seductive. If you reduce the invasion to a single sadist, you don't have to look at the system that keeps producing these outcomes. You don't have to admit that kingdoms were being conquered not only by violence, but by the repeated decision to buy time at any cost. The Great Army is terrifying, yes, but it is also opportunistic. It doesn't invent England's fractures. It audits them. It finds the weak seams and pulls. And it learns something crucial in Mercia. England's rulers will pay. They will negotiate. They will call it peace. Which means the invaders can escalate the terms. Because once you've proven a kingdom will hand over treasure to avoid slaughter, the next demand doesn't have to be treasure. It can be strategic access, a base, a winter camp, horses, grain, hostages. The payments begin to blur into governance. The line between tribute and rule erodes until it's basically gone. And now the Great Army faces a decision that reveals its true nature. If this war were only revenge, the story would end after kings die and tribute flows. But the army doesn't stop. It pivots again, toward a kingdom that already paid once and thought it had purchased immunity. East Anglia, the place that handed over horses like a bribe. The place that tried to buy a quiet winter. The place that is about to learn the darkest rule of conquest by invoice. A payment doesn't end the threat. It proves you can be charged again. So here's the open loop. When the invaders return to the very kingdom that cooperated, when they come not for negotiation, but for spectacle, what does that reveal about the purpose of terror? Is it punishment, or is it a demonstration designed to make every other ruler stop believing in the possibility of peace at all? Because the next king they break will not be broken only with steel. He will be broken into a story. East Anglia had done what frightened kingdoms do when they realize they can't win a fight on schedule. It paid. It handed over horses and told itself the lie that payments create boundaries. That if you give a predator what it wants, the predator becomes a partner. That a bargain, once made, creates rules. But conquest by invoice has one rule only. The debtor never decides when the debt is paid. When the Great Army returns to East Anglia, it returns with the confidence of a force that has tested England's reflexes and found them predictable. York proved kings can be removed. Mercia proved tribute can be normalized. East Anglia is now the demonstration of something colder, that compliance does not purchase safety. It purchases postponement, and postponement is just time for the invader to increase the price. The sources give us the hard frame. The kingdom is overrun, its king killed, and the political map loses another crown. That much is the historical bedrock. But then the record changes texture. Because Edmund's death does not survive mainly as a military report, it survives as a moral weapon. Christian memory forging a martyr out of a defeated king. In other words, even the victims turn pain into governance. So let's not lie to ourselves about what we're watching. When later writers describe Edmund refusing to submit, refusing to abandon his faith, refusing to become a puppet, Those details are not just information, they are instruction. They are meant to teach an audience how to behave under occupation. Hold the line, keep the faith. Make your body the battlefield if your armies cannot. That does not make the story worthless. It makes it powerful in a different way. It tells us what the conquered needed to believe in order to survive the humiliation of losing. And the conquerors? They needed their own kind of story. Because terror isn't only about killing. It's about shaping the imagination of everyone who hears about the killing. If you want to rule without garrisoning every village, you need fear to travel ahead of you like weather. You need your violence to become a rumor that does administrative work. That's why Edmund matters. Even if you strip away every miracle, every embellished line, the political logic remains brutal. A king's death can function like a policy memo. Kill the crown publicly enough, and the lesser men start negotiating without being asked. The later tradition paints the scene with a precision designed to haunt. The king is offered a choice: submit and live, or refuse and die. It frames the moment as a duel of civilizations. Christ against the old gods, purity against barbarism. But notice what that framing does. It distracts from the actual mechanism of conquest. Not theology, but leverage. A puppet king is cheaper than a burned countryside. A living king who obeys you can collect taxes for you. A dead king cannot. So if Edmund is killed, it isn't because death is useful in itself. It's because the manner of death becomes useful. And here is the central psychological collision. Martyrdom and terror are competing propaganda systems. The invader wants you to believe resistance is pointless. The martyr story wants you to believe resistance is the only thing that gives your life meaning. Both sides understand that bodies are not just bodies. They are symbols that can be spent. So the accounts describe a performance. Edmund is bound, sometimes to a tree, sometimes to a post, and shot with arrows again and again. The image is not subtle. It is designed to be remembered. Not a quick beheading, not an efficient execution, but a slow demonstration of control over the victim's suffering. Eventually, the narrative says, the king is finished off, beheaded, and his head is thrown away, denied burial, denied dignity. Then the miracle enters, a wolf guarding the head, a voice calling from the brush, the recovered relic, the shrine that turns the king's defeat into a local sacred economy. Here's what we can say without cheating. The death of Edmund becomes a pivot point because it is converted into a durable story. A king dies, and a saint is manufactured from the corpse. Pilgrimage follows. Memory consolidates. Identity hardens. The conquered learn to interpret their loss not as evidence of God's absence, but as evidence of God's demand. That is how societies survive being broken. They repaint the wound as purpose, but do not miss the darker mirror. The invaders are doing the same thing from the other side. Whether the great army's leaders consciously designed Edmund's death as theatre in the way later writers describe it, is something the evidence cannot confirm with surgical certainty. Yet, the system does not require certainty. The system requires effect. And the effect is clear. Another English kingdom is neutralized, and fear ripples outward. The great army gains freedom of action because fewer enemies remain capable of coordinated resistance. This is the part where modern audiences want to insert a single mastermind, usually Ivar, and call it genius. But even if you never pin one name to the act, the pattern stands. Conquest has learned to combine logistics with psychology. Horses make speed. Winter camps make permanence. Public death makes compliance cheaper. And now the story turns again. Because after Edmund, England is not just losing battles. It is losing the structure that makes battles matter. Kings die, kingdoms weaken, alliances become desperate, payments become routine. And the Great Army, this coalition that began as a fleet, starts behaving like a political machine that can reallocate violence where it will produce the highest return. Yet, there is a strange consequence hiding inside Edmund's martyrdom. The conqueror's terror and the victim's sanctification both create unity. Not unity out of love. Unity out of pressure. The invader, by breaking kingdoms, forces survivors to stop competing and start aligning. The victim, by becoming a saint, gives those survivors a symbol powerful enough to endure the shame. So here is the open loop that should make you uncomfortable. If terror is meant to dissolve resistance, why does it sometimes do the opposite? Why does it create the very identity that will eventually rise against it? Because the next phase of this war will prove that England's survival won't come from a single heroic battle. It will come from turning fear back into infrastructure. And to do that, someone has to learn the invader's method and build a system stronger than terror. But first, the record does something unsettling. The name that later tradition can't stop repeating, Ivar, begins to fade from the English page. Not because the story ends, but because the sources do. And in that silence, a new table is set across the sea. And then, after York, after Mercia's bargaining, after Edmund's crown is turned into a relic, the record does something that should terrify you more than any torture story. It stops naming the monster. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle, so eager to count disasters, simply drifts away from the figure later memory can't shut up about. One moment you're being told there is a mind behind the storm, a name behind the coalition. The next, that name fades into the margin, not with a funeral, not with a defeat, not with closure, just absence. This is where bad history begins, because audiences hate silence. Silence feels like a plot hole, and plot holes invite fantasies. He vanished. He fled. He died of a curse. He was secretly buried to poison invaders. The narrative instinct is to fill the gap with a scene dramatic enough to justify the missing ink. But the honest move, the historian's move, is uglier and more confrontational. The silence is telling you the limits of the lens. Medieval sources aren't omniscient cameras. They are institutions writing for survival. They write what matters to them, what they can confirm, what serves their moral architecture. Names appear when they are useful, and disappear when the world becomes too chaotic, too distant, or too politically inconvenient to describe in detail. Sometimes the monster doesn't vanish. The spotlight does. So when the Chronicle stops mentioning Ivar, the safest conclusion is not he's gone. It's our English record is no longer tracking him as an individual. The war continues. The machine continues. But the story changes angle, and this is where the governing question sharpens. If conquest is a system, if it survives on mobility, wintering, tribute, and fear, then it doesn't require a single mastermind to persist. It requires something more durable, a network, a set of habits, a coalition logic that can outlive any one man. Names become less important than methods. That is why empires can survive assassinations. That is why terror can reproduce. Still, humans can't resist the hunt for a face. So the story follows the shadow across the sea, into a different archive with different priorities. The Irish annals aren't writing the same moral sermon as English monks. They don't care about England's unity. They care about wards, kings, battles, sieges, and the shifting balance of power around the Irish Sea. And in those annals, around the moment the English record grows quiet, a new name rises: Ivar. Now, here's the trap. Names in this world aren't stable identity cards. They are sounds traveling across languages and scripts, Old Norse to Irish to Latin to English. Each scribe writing what he hears, each political community naming the same threat in its own tongue. That's why historians argue about whether Ivar and Imar are the same person. The question isn't childish, it matters, because it reveals what we're actually doing when we narrate history. We're not only reconstructing events, we're reconstructing how people recognized power. But even if you refuse to collapse the names into one man, the strategic shift is unmistakable. The center of gravity moves from English kingdoms to the Irish Sea. And the Irish Sea is not a backdrop, it is an engine. Because this is the part the Vikings as berserkers stereotype can't explain. An army cannot stay an army on glory alone. Glory doesn't feed mouths. Glory doesn't repair ships. Glory doesn't pay for iron. If the great army is going to keep existing, if it's going to keep wintering, moving, extorting, besieging, then it must plug into a supply chain that turns violence into money and money into more violence. That supply chain runs through ports, and the port that begins to look like the dark heart of this world is Dublin. Not yet the stone and cathedral city people imagine, but a fortified trading node, a place where ships can be repaired, goods can be moved, alliances can be negotiated, and wealth can be converted into manpower. A port is not just a place you arrive, it's a place you store power. It's where you can turn a raid into a market, a captive into currency, a rumor into leverage. This is where the story's moral cost becomes impossible to keep abstract. Because once war becomes commercial, you don't just conquer land. You reorganize human beings, you move them, you price them, you make bodies legible to profit. Here's the confrontation. The same logic that makes tribute reasonable in Mercia makes human trafficking efficient in a port economy. Once you accept that fear can be translated into payment, the form of payment can mutate. Silver, grain, horses, hostages, captives. The mechanism stays the same. The ledger just changes the column heading. And this is also where the monster myth becomes even more useful, because a myth can hide a system. If you tell yourself the violence is driven by one sadist, you don't have to face the reality that entire networks benefited. Merchants, shipbuilders, allies, local rulers who traded access for protection, people who called it pragmatism because the alternative was being the next example. So ask yourself what the silence in the Chronicle really means. It means the war has grown beyond a single narrative line. England's story is no longer contained inside England. The invasion is now part of an Irish sea world where politics is amphibious. Kingdoms on land, power on water, and ports that turn geography into destiny. And here's the plot, turn that should land like a knife. The next major victories won't look like heroic battles. They'll look like something far colder. Sieges, logistics, thirst, and mass movement of people. Because once your base is stable, you can attack targets that are unattackable by brute force. You can starve stone. You can weaponize patience. The English monks can stop naming the monster if they want. The system doesn't care. The system has found a new table to play on. And somewhere north of the Irish Sea, there is a fortress that believes its cliffs make it safe. A place that thinks walls and height equal immunity. A place that has forgotten the oldest truth of siege warfare. You don't have to climb a fortress to conquer it. You only have to cut its water. Dublin doesn't enter this story with trumpets. It enters with mud. Not the postcard Dublin. No stone cathedral skyline, no national romance, no clean borders. In the 9th century, it is a fortified node on the edge of a violent ocean economy. Timber walls, ship sheds, smoke, salt, tar, and the constant arithmetic of survival. And that is exactly why it matters. Because once an invasion stops being a seasonal raid, it needs something raids don't need. It needs permanence, repair, storage, a place where violence can be converted into wealth, then converted back into violence. This is where the myth of the barbarian becomes a convenient lie for everyone involved. If you imagine Vikings only as axemen intoxicated by blood, you miss the real transformation. The war stops being a series of attacks and becomes a business model. Not in the cartoon sense, no suits, no contracts you can frame on a wall, but in the cold sense that every campaign must pay for the next one. A coalition army can't live on glory. It lives on supplies, silver, and systems that make those things reliable. And ports make reliability possible. A port is where ships become reusable, where raiders stop being guests of the wind and become owners of routes, where intelligence travels faster than armies, where alliances are negotiated not with morality, but with access. Who gets to dock? Who gets to trade? Who gets protected? Who gets crushed? The Irish annals don't write this like a philosophy essay. They write it like weather reports of catastrophe, fleets arriving, kings falling, captives taken, the sea spitting violence onto land. But if you read them as power mechanics, you see it. Dublin is the switchboard. And this is the part you can't keep clean. Because once war is routed through commerce, people become cargo. Not as a metaphor, as an accounting reality. Captives are transportable wealth. Ransom is delayed payment. Forced labor is extracted time. The same logic that turned peace into tribute in Mercia turns bodies into movable assets in a port economy. When a society accepts that fear can be translated into payment, it should not be surprised when the form of payment evolves into the most brutal commodity available, human beings. So when later storytellers say the conqueror moved the chessboard to Ireland, don't hear romance, hear strategy. England had been a campaign of destabilization, kings removed, kingdoms hollowed, the political structure made porous. The Irish Sea offers something different, a way to hold power without needing to stand inside every conquered village. Control the sea lanes, and you control the options of everyone on the coast. You control where help can come from, and where it cannot. You control which communities get to be connected, and which get to be isolated. Isolation is the first stage of conquest. Names appear in the sources: Am-Laib, Imar. Figures who function like focal points for wider coalitions. It is tempting to collapse everything into a single mastermind because the brain wants one face to blame. But the deeper truth is worse. Even if one man dies, the port remains. The routes remain. The market remains. That's what makes systems so terrifying. They outlive the personalities we attach to them. And now you can see why England's Chronicle went quiet about individuals. From an English monk's perspective, the horror is local. York falls, kings die, the countryside burns, saints are made from corpses. But from the Irish Sea perspective, the horror is structural. Fleets are assembled, campaigns are financed, captives are moved, and the sea becomes a conveyor belt. The center of gravity isn't a battlefield, it's a harbor. This is the moment the story stops being about raids and becomes about capacity. Capacity to launch campaigns farther and longer. Capacity to sustain wintering forces. Capacity to return again and again until resistance doesn't feel noble. It feels irrational. And here is the confrontational point. Ports don't run themselves. Someone feeds them. Someone builds ships. Someone trades. Someone benefits. A violent empire on the water requires ordinary collaboration on land, locals making deals, rivals selling access, communities choosing the least bad option and calling it pragmatism. A port economy is a mirror that doesn't flatter. It shows how quickly survival can be reorganized into complicity. But a system like this still has a limit. Not moral limit, mechanical limit. The sea can move men, but it cannot magically crack stone. There are targets that cannot be taken by speed. There are strongholds that laugh at cavalry. And if your power depends on keeping the machine fed, those strongholds become insults. They become the kind of problem you must solve publicly, because every fortress that survives is a rumor that your terror has boundaries. So the war pivots again, toward a place that looks like nature itself is defending it. Altclut, Dumbarton Rock, a volcanic plug rising straight out of the River Clyde, cliffs that turn arrows into jokes, a stronghold with centuries of confidence baked into its posture. You can't rush it. You can't raid it. You can't win it with the old summer logic. And this is where the conquest reveals its most modern instinct. If you can't storm a fortress, don't waste bodies trying. Don't turn courage into a public funeral. Use patience. Use denial. Use thirst. Turn time itself into a weapon. Because a rock can't be bribed. A wall can't be intimidated. But every fortress has one enemy it cannot outfight forever: the absence of water. So here is the question that pulls us forward. When the machine of terror meets a fortress that refuses to be terrified, what does the conqueror do? Double down on spectacle, or evolve into something colder than brutality? In the next part, you'll see the answer, and it won't be a heroic clash. It will be a siege that turns an impregnable kingdom into inventory. Dumbarton Rock doesn't look conquerable. That's the point. A mass of volcanic stone rising out of the River Clyde like a clenched fist. Cliffs that mock ladders, walls that turn arrows into decoration, and a psychological advantage more potent than any weapon. The defenders believe nature itself is on their side. Empires break themselves on places like this because they mistake unreachable for unkillable. They come with courage and leave with corpses. But the Irish Sea War has already taught the invaders a different lesson. If conquest is a system, you don't waste your system on vanity. You don't spend men to prove a point when you can spend time and achieve the same result with fewer losses. The fortress cannot be stormed? Fine. Then the fortress will be starved. Not of bravery, of water. This is the cold genius of siege warfare, and it is the moment the Viking story stops being a collection of raids and becomes a demonstration of administrative violence. A raid is impulsive. A siege is governance in embryo. It requires discipline, supply control, patience, intelligence, and the willingness to wait while your enemy collapses from inside. It is not the axe that wins. It is the calendar. Alt-Clut, Dumbarton, falls into that category of safe places that become myths while they're still alive. Because most people don't understand what makes a fortress function. They imagine strength as stone and height. But fortresses are organisms. They need water, they need food, they need morale. And the most heavily defended rock in Scotland still has the same humiliating weakness as a peasant hut. The human body cannot negotiate with thirst. So the campaign doesn't begin with an assault. It begins with containment, cutting routes, disrupting access, turning surrounding land into a no-man's zone, making every attempt to resupply feel like a suicide run. Months pass, not in cinematic fast-forward, but in the slow grinding way that destroys confidence. This is where impregnable starts to rot. The walls are still standing, but time is doing what no battering ram could do. It's making the defenders imagine their own failure. And inside the fortress, the horror isn't a battle cry. It's a dry mouth. You can picture the logic of desperation tightening. Water rationed, animals dying, hygiene collapsing, wounds that would be manageable in normal conditions becoming fatal. Every day, the defenders have to decide whether to spend their remaining strength on a sortie that might break the siege, or conserve it and watch their reserves die anyway. The invader doesn't have to outfight them. He only has to outlast them. When the fortress finally yields, it isn't because the defenders suddenly become cowards. It's because the system of life inside the walls can no longer be maintained. That is the brutal truth siege warfare exposes. Courage doesn't create water. Faith doesn't create food. Height doesn't create escape. The surrender is not a moral collapse. It is a biological inevitability. Now comes the part that makes this more than a military victory. Because the conquest of a fortress isn't just about the fortress. It's about what you do with the people who thought the fortress protected them. This is where the Irish annals hit you with a line so stark it feels like a ledger entry, not a story. The return to Dublin with a vast fleet, traditionally given as 200 ships, loaded not only with goods, but with captives. Angles, Britons, Picts, people stripped from their homes and turned into cargo. This is the Irish sea system revealing its true face. A raid takes treasure. A siege produces inventory. If you want to understand the political psychology here, stop imagining violence as an emotional overflow. Imagine it as a signal. The siege tells every rival kingdom, your walls won't save you if your wells can be neutralized. But the captives tell a different audience something even darker. Resistance doesn't just get you killed, it gets you redistributed. You can be removed from the map entirely, sold, ransomed, forced into labor, used to fund the next campaign. And notice how perfectly this fits the logic we've been tracing since 865. England tried to buy peace with horses. Mercia learned peace could be priced like rent. East Anglia learned payment only invites future invoices. Now Scotland learns something colder. Conquest isn't only about who rules you, it's about who owns the right to move you. That's why Dublin matters. It's not merely a base, it's a converter. It turns geography into profit, and profit into more ships, more men, more leverage. It makes violence sustainable. It makes terror scalable. A fortress falls, and the result isn't just a broken enemy. It's fuel, human fuel. The most morally corrosive kind, because it doesn't just destroy, it reorganizes. So when later narratives call this period the height of the conqueror's power, you can see why. Not because he won one dramatic battle, but because he proved a system could reach across multiple kingdoms and return richer than it left. That is what an empire looks like before it calls itself an empire. Routes, ports, captives, tribute, and the quiet collapse of the idea that any region is out of reach. But there's a problem with systems built on fear. They require the rumor of invincibility to keep paying dividends. The moment the system looks mortal, the costs rise. Allies reconsider. Subjects resist. Rival leaders stop paying. And the sources do something ominous right after they show you the machine at full speed. They reduce the man at the center to a sentence. A death recorded without poetry, without closure. Just an ending that feels like a receipt stamped paid. So here's the open loop. If the Irish Sea War reached a moment where power looked absolute, fleets, sieges, captives, ports, how does a figure like this actually end? Not in legend, but in the cold language of annals. And why do archaeologists, centuries later, still dig for a body that the records refuse to describe? Because the next part begins where stories usually end, with a death that is almost too brief to be believed, and a graveyard where bones insist the war was real even when names dissolve into myth. The end, in the real record, is almost insulting. After all the noise, after York's walls, Mercia's bargains, East Anglia's collapse, Dumbarton's thirst, and the Irish Sea turning violence into commerce, the man most people want to call the mastermind is dismissed with the emotional weight of a tax note. In the Irish annals, the entry is blunt. Imar, king of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain, ended his life. No heroic final stand, no curse, no cinematic farewell, just a line that closes a file. That should make you angry. It should feel wrong, because it exposes the dirty mechanics of historical memory. The more a figure becomes a monster in later storytelling, the more you expect a monster's ending. But records don't exist to satisfy your narrative appetite. Records exist to keep institutions functioning. A monk copying an annal isn't writing for your entertainment. He's writing for continuity. Who ruled? Who died? What changed? The horror, for him, is not the gore. The horror is instability. And that's exactly why the gap opens. The moment the annals go cold, later storytellers rush in with heat. He died of a sudden hideous disease. His body broke. The curse followed him. His bones were buried to poison invaders. But here's the confrontation you need if you're serious about sources. That famous phrase, sudden, hideous disease, is not a universal stamp you can slap onto Ivar because it sounds dramatic. In the Irish tradition, that wording attaches to other figures in other contexts. The record is messy, and messy records produce clean lies when people get lazy. So what can we say without cheating? We can say a powerful Norse leader named Ivar dies in 873 and is given a title that screams scale of all Ireland and Britain. That doesn't mean he personally held every inch like a modern nation state. It means contemporaries recognized a reach, a dominance in the Irish sea world, a gravitational pull large enough to be named. It means the system was real enough to terrify scribes into precision. But then the next question becomes unbearable. Where is the body? Because bodies are where myths go to either die or multiply. If you can show a grave, you can pin a story to the earth. If you can't, the story becomes airborne. It can be used anywhere, by anyone, for any moral purpose. That is why archaeology enters this narrative like an accusation. In Repton, in England, excavations uncovered what does not feel like a normal churchyard. A mass of human remains, hundreds, commingled and reburied. Evidence of violent trauma, a deposit that fits uncomfortably well with what the Chronicles says about the great army wintering there in the late 9th century. This is not saga poetry. This is the ground refusing to forget. And the ground forces a brutal clarity. Even if names dissolve, the machine existed. The wintering army existed. Men died in numbers large enough to require an unnatural burial solution. And the burial wasn't random. It wasn't a casual dumping. It suggests a kind of structured aftermath. Whether that structure is reverence, necessity, disease management, or hurried ritual, the point is the same. A mobile coalition came, stayed, and left a scar that bones still carry. Then comes the temptation, the most dangerous kind, the desire to locate a single main character inside that evidence and declare victory over uncertainty. One grave in particular becomes bait for that temptation. An unusually prominent burial, armed, symbol-marked, distinct from the mass. People look at it and ask the question. Modern storytelling can't stop asking, is this him? Is this Ivar? But archaeology is not a casting director. A high-status warrior in a war camp is not automatically the famous name you want. A dramatic burial does not equal a dramatic biography. And this is where the story's philosophy of power turns back on you. Your hunger for a single villain is the same psychological weakness conquest exploits. It makes complexity easier to swallow. It makes systems feel like personalities. It makes you think the problem can be solved by removing a man, when the real problem is that the method outlives him. Because even if you could prove the skeleton's identity, which you cannot with certainty hear, the deeper mechanism would still stand. The invasion was not held together by one set of bones. It was held together by logistics, incentives, fear, and the willingness of fractured kingdoms to treat survival like a private purchase instead of a collective defense. And that brings us back to the governing question with a tighter grip. Was England broken by a monster, or by a system that made ordinary decisions feel inevitable? Pay for peace, give horses, trade time for humiliation, let someone else burn first. Those choices are not made by villains in black cloaks. They're made by normal rulers trapped in bad options. And that's why the cost is so moral. The system doesn't require you to become evil. It only requires you to become practical. Now, look at what happens when the record writes the death like a receipt. The myth doesn't die with the man. The myth gets stronger, because absence is fertile. It invites the cursed bones stories. It invites medical theories. It invites ritual fantasies. It invites the comforting lie that the terror had one source. But the war itself doesn't vanish with a name. It fractures, like all coalitions do when the organizing gravity weakens. Some leaders settle, some keep raiding, some turn conquest into farming and law. And somewhere in the south, in the one kingdom not yet fully devoured, a different kind of response is forming. Less romantic than heroism, more effective than prayer. Infrastructure. So here's your open loop. If the monster fades into silence, why doesn't England recover immediately? Why does the pressure continue until a young king is driven into the marshes, forced to rebuild his state into a machine strong enough to fight a machine? Because in the next part, fear meets something it hates. A system that learns. A coalition held together by momentum can look like destiny, right up until the moment the momentum breaks. After the peak years, the invasion doesn't end so much as it changes phase. The great army stops behaving like a single spear tip and starts behaving like what it always was underneath the story. Multiple warbands with overlapping interests, temporarily aligned by profit, pressure, and opportunity. When the organizing gravity weakens, coalitions do what they always do. They split. Some leaders keep moving. Others realize something the Chronicles barely have words for. The richest conquest isn't the village you burn, it's the land you keep. That's why one of the most important turning points in this entire saga doesn't look like a battle. It looks like administration. The record describes Vikings sharing out land in Northumbria and beginning to support themselves, ploughing, settling, turning violence into property. This is the moment the storm becomes weather. Raiders become neighbors. The terror doesn't leave. It changes uniforms. And that, psychologically, is even worse for the conquered, because now the enemy isn't a seasonal nightmare. It's a permanent demographic fact. Meanwhile, the other half of the machine keeps hunting. A warlord named Guthrum emerges as the new focal point in the south and east. Whether he was a disciple of earlier leaders in the romantic sense is less important than this. He inherits the method. He understands speed, surprise, wintering, and the leverage of attacking. When a society is busy being holy, tired, or politically distracted. Terror isn't just brutality. Terror is timing. and timing is exactly what Wessex can't afford to lose. Wessex is the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom left standing with the capacity to define what England might even mean in the future. If it collapses, the island doesn't just get conquered, it gets reorganized under a different legal gravity. Names on the map change, laws change, inheritance changes, language changes. That's the real stakes beneath every dramatic shield wall, the future bureaucracy of everyday life. In early 878, Guthrum strikes with a move that feels like a signature of this entire era. A surprise attack on Alfred's position at Chippenham. The point isn't just to win a fight, it's to make the king's very existence unstable, to force him into flight, to make leadership look like a liability. Because once the king becomes a fugitive, people stop risking their lives to support him. They start negotiating individually. Alfred escapes, but barely, and is driven into the Somerset levels, a landscape that is less romantic swamp exile and more political humiliation made physical. The king of the last resisting kingdom reduced to hiding, dependent on local loyalty, surviving on whatever can be moved through reeds without being detected. If you want to understand power as psychology, stare at that image. The crown doesn't fall with a single sword. It falls when people begin to believe it can no longer protect them. This is where most stories beg for a miracle, a heroic rally, a prophecy fulfilled. But what actually changes the trajectory here is something colder than inspiration: reform. Alfred doesn't merely survive, he studies why his society keeps losing. He sees the problem the Great Army exploited from the beginning: reaction time. An army raised by local levy is slow. It must be summoned. It must gather. It bleeds the harvest to fight, then goes home to avoid starvation. Against a mobile enemy, that model is a machine designed to arrive late. So, Alfred begins rebuilding Wessex as if he is finally willing to pay the real price of security. Not in speeches, in infrastructure. He reorganizes service so the kingdom can keep men available without collapsing agriculture entirely. He builds and strengthens a network of fortified places, burhs, so that undefended targets stop existing in the way the invaders depend on. Fortifications aren't glamorous, but they do something terror hates. They deny easy wins. They force the enemy to spend time. Time is the enemy of a raiding economy, and he pushes another reform that matters even if the details shift across sources. He contests the sea. Not because ships are romantic, but because the war is amphibious. Control the water, and you control the enemy's ability to choose where the war happens. Deny that choice, and you deny the psychological advantage of surprise. This is the confrontation the invaders didn't want. A kingdom learning to become a system. When Alfred finally emerges from the marshes and gathers men, Somerset, Wiltshire, Hampshire answering the call, the story isn't a hero returns, it's a state stabilizes. The battle at Edington becomes the collision point where terror meets preparation. The shield walls grind. The outcome matters because it breaks the invader's aura of inevitability. Alfred wins, and then he does something that reveals how deeply he understands the psychology of conquest. He doesn't turn victory into a simple massacre. He pursues, besieges, squeezes, and then negotiates from dominance. Because killing a Viking leader can create a new myth. It can invite fresh fleets. It can reset the cycle. Alfred chooses a different weapon: legitimacy. He brings Guthrum into a Christian framework through baptism, making him, at least in theory, legible to diplomacy rather than pure predation. Then comes the line on the map, a division of authority that will harden into the Danelaw, a region where Danish customs and law have recognized weight. This is the strangest irony of the entire era. The invaders who shattered the Old English order force the survivors to invent a new one. Fear pushes the island toward consolidation. Terror creates the demand for structure, and structure, once built, can outlast the terror that inspired it. But the ledger doesn't close here. The map is not saved, it is rewritten. A large part of England is now acknowledged as different, legally, culturally, politically, because a foreign system proved it could stay. So here's the question we have to carry into the final part. If Alfred's infrastructure contains the invasion but cannot erase its footprint, what does that mean about the monster story we began with? Was the true legacy a man's cruelty, or the fact that fear forced England to become a nation by learning to think like an occupying power? Because the last step is not another battle. It's the philosophical verdict. When violence becomes administration, who actually wins? Those who swing the axes, or those who learn to turn terror into law? So, here is the most uncomfortable truth this story keeps trying to avoid. England wasn't saved by purity. It wasn't forged by heroism. It was assembled under pressure, like a body forming scar tissue around a wound. The invaders didn't just burn towns, they changed what the island had to become in order to survive. And that brings us back to the governing question we planted at the start, the one the myths keep dancing around. When a kingdom collapses, is it defeated by violence, or by the moment fear becomes a system? Contracts, winter camps, supply lines, and starts collecting interest. Look at what actually did the work. Not one battle, not one execution, not one monster. The turning point was structural. In 865, the great army arrives and refuses to leave for winter. That is a political declaration more radical than any raid, because wintering turns terror into permanence. It creates a base, a schedule, a rhythm of coercion. And once you have permanence, you can do something that looks like genius, but is really just exploitation of predictable weakness. You can pressure a frightened kingdom into paying you with the one commodity that turns a sea threat into inland control: horses. That horse deal is the first receipt. It is the moment fear becomes contractual. East Anglia tries to buy survival and instead finances its own strategic encirclement. Mercia tries to rent time and discovers that peace is just tribute with better branding. Northumbria's civil war tries to outmaneuver internal rivals and hands the invader the most valuable gift a kingdom can offer: division. York falls not because the Vikings are magic, but because the enemy is slow, fractured, and still pretending war is seasonal. Then comes the psychological layer that people mistake for the whole story: spectacle, rumors of ritual killing, the disputed blood eagle, the saint-making of Edmund. Whether every detail is literal matters less than the mechanism those details reveal. Terror travels, stories govern. A rumor can lower the cost of conquest by raising the cost of resistance. A martyr story can do the same in reverse, by making resistance feel meaningful even when it is militarily futile. What you're watching is not just brutality. You're watching competing propaganda systems trying to colonize the imagination. And then the record does something cruelly honest. It refuses to give you closure. The name Ivar fades from the English lens, and a Norse king named Imar appears in Irish annals, ruling in an Irish sea world where ports and fleets matter as much as armies. The war shifts from destroying to organizing. Dublin becomes a node where violence learns accounting. Ships repaired, alliances brokered, captives moved like inventory. A fortress like Dumbarton falls not to berserker courage, but to siege patience, to the weaponization of thirst. The return with a massive fleet and captives is the system revealing its darkest efficiency. Conquest isn't only taking land, it's taking the right to move human beings. Then, in 873, the man, whatever his exact identity across languages, ends in the record like an entry in a book. No epic, just the system continuing. And that is precisely why the boneless debate, fascinating as it is, can become a distraction. Was the nickname medical, metaphorical, a scribal mishearing? Those questions matter to biography. But this story is bigger than biography. The real bonelessness here is political. It's the way fragmented kingdoms bend when fear is applied repeatedly. It's the way ordinary rulers make reasonable decisions, payments, bargains, appeasements that keep the machine fed. You don't need villains in capes. You need incentives strong enough to make surrender feel like pragmatism. Now consider Alfred. Alfred doesn't defeat the invasion with a single righteous battle. He defeats a method by building a counter-method. The invaders won because they could move fast, strike soft targets, and winter safely. Alfred responds with infrastructure, fortified berths, reorganized service, contested waterways, and a defensive grid that denies easy prey. He takes away the invaders' favorite advantage, mobility, and replaces it with something far less cinematic and far more powerful: response time. That is what a state is when you strip away the poetry. It is a machine designed to respond faster than chaos can spread. Eddington matters because it breaks inevitability. The baptism and treaty matter because they convert a war economy into a legal boundary. The Danelaw matters because it admits the truth. The invaders didn't just lose. They stayed. They became law. They became neighbors. They became part of the island's demographic and legal fabric. So here is the resolution to our question, with no comfort and no romance. England was broken not by a monster's cruelty, but by a system that turned fear into logistics. Horses, winter camps, tribute, and by a political landscape willing to pay for private survival instead of collective defense. And England was saved not by moral purity, but by learning the same lesson and building an infrastructure strong enough to contain the system that terror created. That is the philosophy of power hiding under the gore. Empires don't need you to believe their myths. They need you to behave as if resistance is irrational. They need you to keep paying. They need you to accept that the ledger is reality. And that's why the Cursed Bones story in 1066, true or not, makes perfect psychological sense. People prefer to imagine conquest can be prevented by destroying a corpse because it avoids the real indictment. Conquest is prevented by destroying the conditions that make fear profitable. The myth says, burn the bones. The record says, stop funding the machine. So when you hear the name, Ivar the Boneless, Don't hear a comic book villain. Hear a warning about systems. The most dangerous weapon in this story isn't the axe. It's the moment terror becomes routine, when violence is no longer an event, but a policy.